This episode of Bullet Heaven was made using Pack-a-Punch SCART cables from Retro Gaming Cables, the OSSC from Video Game Perfection, and the Retrobit 2.5 GHz Wireless Saturn controller from Stone Age Gamer.
Ringleader to base. Commencing operation. 3, 2, 1, go! First stop. Enemy outfit. Let's see what you got.
In episode 6, who even remembers this? In episode 6 of Bullet Heaven, in an age all that time ago that didn't dive especially deep into the games we checked out, we took a real brief look at DoDonPachi for the Sega Saturn. It's a cave classic, and we definitely dug it, though the Saturn version, as we came to find out, does suffer in a few ways compared to other versions of the game. But DoDonPachi wasn't even the first game of its kind to hit the Saturn. That honor belongs to
Donpachi, which is a Tate vertical scrolling game that first saw release to arcades from Cave in May 1995 in Japan, and worldwide in November the same year, with the Sega Saturn release following in April 1996 by Atlus. It also saw release to the original PlayStation from SPS the same year and on PSN in 2012 as a download from Hamster. This series has gotten a lot of attention and many sequels over the years, almost all of which we've seen on Bullet Heaven so far. So is Donpachi even worth a look at this point? Let's take a closer look.
Compared to like every other DoDonPachi game in existence, Donpachi is actually a much more basic game. But it also has a lot of the features that are still a part of the series, even in DoDonPachi Saidaiojo, the series' latest mainline iteration.
Starting out, players have access to the same 3 ship types that would be seen in every subsequent DoDonPachi game with the exception of Daijojo. The red ship has a narrow, forward-firing shot and fast speed, the green helicopter has sweeping fire depending on the player's movement with medium speed, and the blue ship features a fixed wide shot with slower speed.
8-way movement resides at the core of the player's control, which is handled by the D-pad. The control here is reasonably tight, though it would be improved upon in later games up until Saidaiojo, where it became noticeably lagged.
Players fire their ship's main weapon with the A button. Tapping the A button will result in rapid shots, while holding it will activate a powerful forward-firing laser. In typical cave fashion, the player's movement will also slow considerably when the laser is engaged. The player's weapons will be upgraded through several power-ups to a maximum level of 5.
But not every power-up will actually increase the player's power. In fact, the player power level will only increase with every second power-up collected. The first of 2 will be stocked in the bomber bar on the bottom of the screen, which will be maintained even if the player dies. Paired with power-ups released after death, a quick recovery can often be made.
Speaking of the bomber bar, players will start the game with a stock of 3 bombers. However, Donpachi does things a little differently with his bomber system. Firstly, as with all of its subsequent follow-ups, Donpachi gives the player flexibility in how the bomber is deployed. A general screen-clearing bomber occurs simply by pressing the B button, but players can also deploy a laser bomber, which fires a supercharged laser for a short duration of time. This can deal severe damage to anything it hits, and can really help during boss encounters.
And players can be pretty liberal with deploying the bomber when the going gets tough. Any given stage from Stage 2 and beyond will give players the chance at collecting additional bomber pickups throughout the game. Players will even get their stock replenished by a certain amount of units at the end of every stage. Using many bombers will also gradually increase the number of units the player can have at a time, but this comes at the cost of large scoring opportunities, which we'll look at later.
Donpachi plays over the course of 5 core stages and continues with a second harder loop. Every stage is also punctuated with a large-scale boss fight where players are challenged with more intense enemy fire and more complex patterns than in the core stage itself. The player's opposition can be pretty intense even on Loop 1, but Loop 2 ramps it up even further with suicide bullets thrown into the mix. A 1cc is definitely manageable with practice, but a 1-0? That's where the real challenge lies.
One thing we did have a hard time with was 2-player co-op. Like all other mainline games in the series, 2 players can join forces to take on the game together. Enemies that drop power-ups will release double the amount, allowing for players to power up symmetrically or faster for a weaker player. However, co-op games make for a pretty frustrating time, as each player's movement can shift where the window scrolls, which in turn changes where bullets and players are on the screen. This can make for a frustrating, confusing time, basically to the point that we feel Donpachi is a better single-player game than it is a co-op endeavor.
Outside of the typical arcade mode, a score attack mode also exists, allowing players to take on the game's 5 stages in an attempt to score as high as possible. It's also basic, but it works.
We had a few issues with the overall performance of the game as well. Namely, there are some gnarly load times in Donpachi, which we suppose is to be expected of any developer's rookie attempt at porting to console, especially at game start, between stages, and curiously when selecting different ships that continue, the pauses can be a little jarring, especially if players aren't anticipating it. These hiccups have definitely been ironed out in later games.
Despite this, DoDonPachi is still a pretty flexible game, even as the first in a long line of games that build even further upon it. However, some of the features we have seen here remain unique only to Donpachi alone. Some we won't miss, others we do. Overall, it makes it worth playing even if you start it with DoDonPachi, like we did. It can be pretty difficult at times, a little rough around the edges and maybe a bit crude when it comes to its power-up system. But this is probably the most tame this series has ever been, with the exception of DoDonPachi Daifukatsu Novice, of course.
Enemy out. Let's see what you got.
Like the main game itself, Donpachi is pretty straightforward when it comes to its scoring. At the core of the game's scoring lies the get point system, in which players can achieve fast, large bonuses through a hit combo.
When players take out any given enemy, a score will be displayed in a small panel found in the top corner of the respective side. If multiple enemies are dispatched within a half second of each other, players will get a much higher point payout for each subsequent one. The bonus applies to large enemies too, which can lead to some pretty great additions to the score.
Players can also uncover a number of additional bonuses as well. Stars can be revealed by shooting specific parts of various stages, which awards the player with 300 points of pickup. These stars are all tallied at the end of the stage, with the total number collected being multiplied by 1,000 points.
Then there's the all-important B bonus, which would become a series mainstay. Players can shoot at certain points in every stage to uncover a B, which can be collected for instant gains. The B bonus only starts at 100 points, but grows with every subsequent B collected. B bonuses can go all the way up to 100,000 points if enough are picked up. If the player dies though, the next B bonus is reset to 200 points again.
Players will also get a 10,000 point bonus for collecting power-ups beyond Power Max, and bombers with a full stock, so keeping things maxed out through the game will definitely add quite a bit more heft to the player's score.
Stage End will award the player with even more bonuses, which depend on a few factors. There's the aforementioned stars, listed as item bonus, but also a bonus for the amount of bombers left in the stock. However, the total capacity will affect how much they're worth. At 3 capacity, their value will be at their maximum, but will drop for every extra bomber added to the overall capacity. Therefore, using bombs as little as possible will grant the player the best bonuses.
Further bonuses starting with Stage 2 will award the player with increasing amounts of points for a no-miss with a 3-bomber capacity. A 1-credit all-clear bonus of 1,000,000 points per remaining life will also be awarded on top of stage scores when the game concludes.
Obviously, it will take a huge amount of skill and practice to get the highest scores as a result. But for those that have the patience and resolve, placing a high should be achievable. Of course, there are no online leaderboards here, so taking a screenshot and posting to a forum of the player's choice is the only real way to rank in globally.
As solid as the gameplay feels, and as involved as the scoring can be, one area that Donpachi is its weakest is in its presentation. The visuals and sound here won't blow anyone's minds, and while they are still serviceable, we've got issues.
Which starts with the visuals. If players are using a normal Yoko monitor, the default scaling looks shimmery and rough, sometimes with gaps between certain elements that should be flush as seen between stages. Several scaling options do exist though, and playing in Tate allows for full 100% scale, making everything look much cleaner.
The actual visuals here aren't terrible, but comes off as drab and basic. There isn't a lot of vibrancy to the stages, and the sprites are smaller, simpler, and less detailed than DoDonPachi would later become. The player's hitbox isn't especially well defined either, but we may do. At the very least, enemy fire is always pink, allowing players to differentiate it at a glance. That the Player 1 and Player 2 ships all have unique colors is a neat touch though.
The sound is another pretty big sticking point. On one hand, we love the over-enthusiastic announcer. On the other, the VO and effects here are loud and poor quality, often with a scratchy, overblown static accompanying them. There is nothing in the game that remedies this.
The soundtrack isn't especially great either. It's serviceable, sure, but there was never a single piece that really stood out to us as something we wanted to hear more of. Quite the opposite actually, as some tracks sound a lot like Striker's 1945 Plus Portable, another completely lackluster to bad soundtrack. But you know, the Stage 1 track is pretty iconic, and the Stage Select track is actually pretty good. Like other aspects of this game, the lackluster OST would be addressed starting with DoDonPachi, and every subsequent game in the series would end up having an excellent musical lineup.
Other little things are a bit on the bland side. The old Cave logo looks like something from Planet Hollywood, and it's jarring when every other title since then has used what we all know and love. The UI is decent despite its simplicity, and the various menus look and feel old and lackluster. Nothing offensive, but nothing great. The ship select screen is pretty cool though, with a good BGM track to boot.
So how does Donpachi on the Sega Saturn stack up? Let's take a look.
Just a couple more shots!
Donpachi's control is a touch unrefined, but still manageable.
Slowdown can make things a little dicey though.
As for Donpachi's challenge, it's pretty easy by Cave standards, so veterans will want to ratchet up the difficulty.
Novices might still have a hard go at this one.
Only 5 stages over 2 loops is a moderate length, but it's nothing especially grand, especially compared to future titles.
There isn't a ton of staying power here with so many better titles available, even on the Saturn.
Donpachi's drab visuals are less than thrilling throughout the game.
Make sure to bust out a Tate monitor because it also looks super ugly on a standard set.
With a boring soundtrack and super scratchy, staticky sound, Donpachi's sound is its weakest attribute.
As much as we love the announcer, he can't save the sound here.
There are undeniably great ideas at play here, and we're happy they were expanded on in future games.
We would have loved to see the bomber replenishment make a return in later games. The multiple power-ups needed to get stronger though? Pass.
Donpachi on Saturn is probably the most affordable 5th generation game in the series across all platforms, but it'll still ding the wallet in noticeable ways. The PlayStation version is much more expensive. We still have to give the original DoDonPachi the deep dive treatment it deserves, but that'll have to wait. In the meantime, Donpachi is a game that, for all of its shortcomings, was still worth playing, and it's a title I'm sure to revisit again on my own. It's very clear that this game was a very early attempt at what Cave would become famous for, and it's a title most Cave and shooter fans will want for their Saturn or PlayStation. But as it stands, Donpachi on the Sega Saturn gets a 3.5 out of 5. You can get a copy of Donpachi for the Sega Saturn at auction. It's time to fire up the Saturn again with our 9000 sub-feature, Guardian Force.
Holy shit, 9,000 already?
Well, if 11 years is already to you.
It just seems like yesterday that we were at 8,000. Where the heck did the time go?
That's a mystery for another time. Now onward to 10,000. Hyperduel awaits.
That's right, Hyperduel. We're coming for ya.